Dear colleagues, distinguished guests and friends of DeZIM, it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to today's event, Getting to Diversity, What Works and What Doesn't, here at the DeZIM-Institut. I'm Noah Ha, the Scientific Managing Director of DeZIM, and I'm delighted to open this timely and important discussion. We are honored to be joined today by Frank Dobbin, Henry Ford Professor of the Social Sciences at Harvard University, whose path-breaking work on organizational diversity continues to reshape how we think about inclusion in the workplace. His latest book, co-authored with Alexandra Kalev, offers a data-rich, empirically grounded assessment of what truly drives sustainable change in organizations. I think a question to many of us here. An issue that is more urgent than ever. Drawing on over 3 decades of research on data from 800 companies, Dobbin and Kalev challenge conventional approaches, such as bias training and enforcement policies, urging us instead to rethink how structural and managerial strategies can better foster equity and inclusion. This work provides critical insight not just for academic debate, but for real-world application in policy, business, and institutions like our own. Following the keynote, we look forward to stimulating panel discussion with 3 esteemed scholars and practitioners in the field. So it's Frank Kalter from the University of Mannheim and one of the directors of DeZIM, Gregory Jackson from Free University Berlin, and Seren Bostanger, postdoctoral researcher at DeZIM. And the discussion will be moderated by Sabrina Zajac from the DeZIM-Institut and from Ruhr University. Where's Sabrina? There. Today's event is part of our commitment at DeZIM to bring together rigorous research and practical dialogue, fostering an informed and critical conversation on the complexities of integration, migration, and social participation in Germany and beyond. Thank you for being here, and I wish us all an enriching and thought-provoking evening. So Frank, the floor is yours for your keynote.
Thank you for the very kind introduction, Noah. I'm very grateful for your warm welcome when I arrived, and for the role of Sabrina Zajac and Elias Steinhilper in bringing me here, suggesting that I be invited. I've really had an amazing time here. I arrived a little over a month ago, and it's just such a dynamic institute, and it's the kind of institute that would be closed in the United States right now. So I'm hoping this doesn't happen to you anytime soon, but it's very encouraging to see this kind of work being done at such scale, and with such vigor and with such enthusiasm somewhere else in the world, even as my part of the world may see the decline in these kinds of endeavors. Feedback isn't a good sign. Okay. So I've been studying diversity programs since I was in graduate school in the early 1980s at Stanford. Usually there's a speaker that's too close. So I've been studying diversity programs since the early 1980s when I was in graduate school at Stanford. Put it closer? Okay. So I grew up in the tail end of the civil rights movement. I remember very well as a kid being dragged to civil rights demonstrations wherever we lived. Where I was a kid, in Texas, in Tennessee, in Boston. I remember the end parts of the civil rights movement very vividly from my pre-adolescence. And it felt like we were really seeing a revolution, and my parents, who were kind of tangentially involved in the movement, and I thought the world was going to change forever. We just thought there would be dramatic change in who was in what positions in the world, in what kinds of colleges people went to in the United States. We just thought the world would immediately change. When I started to look into diversity and equal opportunity programs in the early 1980s in graduate school, I was pretty discouraged by the speed at which progress was happening. There had been a bit of progress, but it seemed to have slowed to a crawl. Progress in the representation of Black and Hispanic people, of Asian men and women, of indigenous people, in management jobs and on university faculties. So what I studied then is what most organizational sociologists like myself studied. We studied the social construction of solutions to the problem of diversity, to the problem of employment discrimination. In federal law in the US, there are no mandates about what you have to do to comply with anti-discrimination laws. So we've had anti-discrimination laws since 1961, but there really are no specific mandates determining what you can and can't do. So employers choose their own practices, and they have chosen a series of practices that target individual bias as the main problem. They've chosen practices that try to identify the problem in people's heads and address the problem in people's heads. And of course, there are problems in people's heads, but as I'll try to argue today, trying to address that directly through training or threats of procedures to bring people who practice discrimination or harassment into line, threats of punishment, have just been broadly ineffective. So that's discouraging, but I think the story that I'll tell today is kind of encouraging, because the things that are most ineffective are highly popular. So you might think, damn, not good. But it's good in a way because they've done all the harm they can do in the US, in corporate America. And the things that actually work are not very popular. So there's tremendous room for growth. There's tremendous room for progress if companies and universities would just adopt the things that actually work. And the things that work are not the things that target individual level bias. So I'm going to talk about data today that we've been collecting for many years. We have a parallel project now. It's about 10 years old. We started this project 20 years ago. Parallel project more than 20 years ago. On university diversity programs. I'm not going to talk about that today, but pretty much well, the conclusions I draw today apply to universities as well. And I think my talk on university diversity programs was recorded, so if you can stand to suffer through another rendition of this talk, you could probably see it online. The data we use for the corporate program come from the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which just announced yesterday that they're going to continue to collect these data, although now they'll be using the data to make sure that employers don't discriminate against white men instead of against people in the other groups. For people in my world, it's very exciting that they're continuing to collect the data. What I'm showing you here are data from all private sector US employers with at least 100 workers, so not the smallest ones, from 1971 to 2018. And this is the percent of workers from each group in management. So it's not the percent of managers who are Black women, it's the percent of Black women in corporate America who are managers. And this is any level of management, low to high. So if you look at the bottom line, the green, light green line, which covers Black women, you see that they made some progress between 1971, when the data started being collected systematically, and the early 1980s. And we aggregated these from millions of observations. So this is our summary statistic. So black women, by about 1985, about 4% of them were in some kind of management job. And if you go to 2018, where this ends, a little over 5% of them were in some kind of management job. So if you look at white men, they've kind of stabilized at around 16%. It will take black women 200 years to reach parity with white men. If you look at Hispanic women or Latinx women, they're about 4% in 1986. And in 2018, they're solid 6%. It will take them 175 years at this rate. Look at black and Hispanic men. In 1983 and in 2018, they are at the same place. It will take them forever. They'll never, at this rate, reach parity with white men. So I show this because people are always telling me, you're making such great progress in the United States, or I know 5 CFOs who are black women. Your odds of making it into management in corporate America really haven't gone up if you're a black or Hispanic person. So I'm going to show you 10 bar charts. I'm summarizing 70 bar charts in 10 that I think are just give you a sense of the pattern of findings we have. And I just want to say that if you think of another program that's like one of the ones I talk about, it probably has similar effects, and we've probably already looked at it. So the data we have, so I've shown you the data that come from the feds. These data are not publicly available, but we managed to get access to them legally. And, and a number of other academics have managed to get access to them legally. I don't know how much longer we'll have access to new iterations, but took a while to get access to them. But so we have data at the firm level and even at the establishment level within firms over time. From 1971, we have it now through 2018. So we can track an individual target in Minneapolis every year, and we know how many black women they had in management. And early on, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, and then 1, 1, 1, 1, 1. Not many. So with those, we put those data together with our own retrospective survey of employer practices, every diversity, work-life, harassment program you can think of, and all kinds of career programs. How do you onboard people? How do you offboard people? So we put all of these into one model with information on the local labor market. What does that look like? With information on non-managers in the same firm. And here, I'm going to show you the results of two-way fixed effects models with fixed effects for the firm and for the year. Over time, these run from 1971 to 2015. With robust standard errors, we run other kinds of models too, but just for simplicity's sake, I'm going to show you the same kinds of models for all of these. All the variables I'll show you are in the same model, as are many other things. So that's a way to ensure that a practice that looks effective is not just standing in for some other practice that happened at the same time. And let me remind you, none of these practices are mandated by law. So this is a great thing about the US. You couldn't do this in most other countries, because compliance practices with anti-gender discrimination laws, for example, tend to be mandated by law. Here, in the US, it's like, you can't discriminate on the basis of gender, figure it out. So McKinsey helped places figure it out. And they seem to have gone for things that didn't work. And they might have been colluding with the firms that they worked with. But anyway, 2 slides on what doesn't work. It doesn't really work to make managers the problem in this scenario. Managers react negatively to being told that they're biased. White men react very negatively to being told they're biased. We all react negatively to being told we're biased. So getting people to do an implicit bias test and then trying to convince them in a room here or online, could be a room like this, that they're actually biased tends to make especially white men, but people in general, angry, unhappy with you. So they may say that they love the training so they don't have to go through it again on the exit survey, but they pretty much don't like it. And interestingly, I'll be at a conference and I'll give this talk and all the white guys will come up to me. Okay, often there's only 6 white guys in a room of 300 people, and they'll all come up to me afterward, and they'll tell me terrible things about diversity management, and I'm like, I'm the guy who talked about how to do this. Do you think I'm on your side because I share your demographic characteristics? But they generally seem to. It also doesn't work to say, here is the grievance process that will allow your employees to try to take your job away if they sense that you've discriminated against them. So we know from a lot of research that implicit bias training does not reduce measured bias, or not for long. So the 10 graphs will all take the same form. So imagine our data set from 1971 to 2015, and we've got this model where we're controlling for everything we can think of, and we're observing what happens after you put in this case, legalistic diversity training for managers. After you put that in, for whatever number of years your firm has it in place before our observations end. So maybe it'll be 8 years, maybe 20 years. And what I'm showing you is the average effect on the share of the group in management. So like the proportion of managers. So if the proportion of managers it's typically about 22% of managers are white women in our sample across all these years, then putting in legalistic diversity training for managers will reduce that by about 11 or 12%. So a little bit below 20%. But that's a significant effect, and it lasts. It lasts until the end of our observation of the firms. We don't see it going down, this negative effect ever declining. That's not what we're supposed to see here. Diversity trainers will generally tell me there's something wrong with my model, or I'm not perhaps I've miscoded what diversity training is, or they'll tell me, no, we don't have normal diversity. I heard this for an hour this morning. We don't have the same diversity training. I won't tell you where I gave a talk this morning. We don't have the same diversity training. Ours is different. Ours won't cause that. And they'll ask me all these questions about, is there a break in the middle, or, they must be doing something wrong. So, but these are only negative effects for any of the groups. They're statistically significant if you see a bar. Where there's no bar, it's just there was a coefficient. I'm not going to show you because we're not sure there's a statistically significant effect. Civil rights grievance procedure. This is how you can bring your manager to a sort of judicial proceeding within your firm to complain that you face discrimination, wage discrimination, promotion discrimination. We know from big federal studies of civil rights grievance procedures, these are discrimination grievance procedures, in the federal bureaucracy, that the most likely thing to happen to you if you bring a complaint is not that the person you complain against loses their job. The most likely thing to happen is that you lose your job. You can't stay on, either because you face harassment from your own manager, because your manager just fires you. Trump would just fire the person who did this, obviously. Or you face just a hostile work environment after bringing the complaint. The disappointing thing is that those two things are the most common of the practices I'm going to talk about. But as I say, they've done kind of all the harm they can do in the United States. Just don't necessarily go down the road we went down, please. So that was making managers the problem. There are ways to make managers part of the solution so they don't feel attacked. So they come to think that it's part of their job to try to promote diversity, and so they come to want to promote diversity. So people don't like being assigned to a committee, but this is what happens when the president of the company asks all of the department heads to please join a diversity committee. So often they send somebody else. They don't go themselves. Sometimes they'll send the black woman just below them, or so they might send somebody else. But what happens is people from all departments who are, if not the leaders, pretty close to the leaders, come together, usually 4 times a year. They look at the data, HR information systems data on who gets hired, who gets fired, who attrits voluntarily, who leaves after the second child, who doesn't get promoted and then leaves. So they look at the data, they try to figure out what's going on, they brainstorm for solutions, and they go back and implement the solutions in their departments. That works, because we're seeing solid positive effects for every historically disadvantaged group. So the question is, how can you make managers part of the solution? And another thing you can do is you can try to activate accountability. So if I think I'm a manager and I'm just on my own, I can do whatever I want, nobody's going to ask me why I did X or Y, then I'm not thinking that carefully about some of my decisions. But if I'm thinking, somebody might ask me why I did this, I'm going to give it a little more thought before I decide whom to promote, which person to hire. When we interviewed diversity managers, this is putting in a full-time diversity manager at the location we're looking at. When we interviewed diversity managers, they bemoan their lack of power. They're just always saying, nobody effing listens to me, I can't get anything done. I tell people the simplest thing, they don't show up for the stupid diversity training, they call in sick the day it's being offered. I spend, the top management team, I'm spending $5,000 a person, 4 of them don't show up, 4 of the 10, Jesus. So, but what they can do is this is what they say, they can go to a manager of a big department and they can say, look, you promoted 4 people to the senior VP level last year. Why didn't you promote Jose? Because Jose looked like he was the most likely person to get promoted. And then the person doesn't immediately promote Jose, but next year, Jose is on top of the list because the person's been called out. They realize that it doesn't look good. Jose has better performance ratings than the 4 people who were promoted. There are also systemic biases in organizations. And these task forces, when you put them together, they start to ferret out the systemic biases. So what are we doing that's not completely fair? What are we doing that's not recognizing all different kinds of people? So most US corporations have formal recruitment programs in which they send existing managers, especially top managers, but middle managers too, to their alma maters to recruit. So guess what? They're going to historically white colleges and they're recruiting from their old fraternities fraternities are segregated. They're gender segregated and they're racially segregated. They're recruiting from their old departments, economics. So guess what? They come back with other white guys like themselves. So how can you change that? Just tell the same people, those very people, while you're in Mississippi, you've gone to Ole Miss, which was a segregated college until relatively recently. In my lifetime, it desegregated. Go to a historically black college too. Go to a Hispanic serving institution too. Go to what used to be a women's college too. And here we're seeing very strong positive effects of that. So, and remember, what we're seeing is like, they recruit usually people right from college. So this is years later, these people are in management. So it doesn't just bring people in the door. Sometimes this is called diversity in DEI. It includes them, because inclusion means you got promoted to be a manager. We kept you around. Studies of mentoring show that, well, I use the Sun Microsystems was a very big mid-sized computer maker. You know, unfortunately, the mid-sized computers that they were making in the 90s, now it fits on this, so we don't really need a mid-sized computer anymore. But very successful mid-sized computer maker. They put in their own mentoring program, and it was done kind of scientifically. So they offered everybody a mentor, although they segmented, like offered half the people, half their employees a mentor. The first thing they found out was that white guys said no thank you. Why did white guys say no thank you? Sorry, 6 people think they're my mentor, and I can't. I just have too many people trying to run my career. But women and people of color signed up very quickly because nobody had volunteered to mentor them. So without a formal mentoring program, women and people of color tend not to get mentors. So here we're seeing solid positive effects for 5 of the historically underrepresented groups, I would say in scientific fields like electronics, software, chemicals. White women and black men also see very strong positive numbers. Just some of these things vary by industry. I just mentioned that because we happen to live in a scientific field. Skill training. Most employers offer skill training, management training. Your supervisor nominates you for management training. Well, guess what? They nominate people who look like management material. They nominate people who look like other managers. So what happens if you let people nominate themselves? Or what happens if you give everybody skill and management training? So this is an example of one kind of training that basically gives management training to everybody. Very strong positive effects. Conventional management training, white men are advantaged by that, where your manager nominates you. Okay. Last idea. So this is, I hesitated about whether to talk about this or whether to talk about other concepts. We've got a lot going on in the book. But I wanted to talk about this because I think the effects that we're seeing for work-life, so I thought about not talking about it because work-life supports in most of Europe are centrally administered, and so if you get paid leave when you have a new child, that's not up to your employer. In the US, it's up to your employer. The employer can give you more or less leave. But I want to show you 3 things that are arguably completely symbolic, don't cost the employer anything, and don't really obligate them to do anything. But they have strong positive effects by challenging the ideal worker norm that, as law professor Joan Williams describes it, portrays the perfect worker, the perfect management aspirant, as somebody who's 24/7 on the job, willing to fly to Toledo at the drop of a hat to deal with a customer, available all the time, middle of the night. If you really need to call me in the middle of the night, use this number so my wife doesn't wake up. So that's the ideal manager. It looks to me like we can change that ideal by getting people to talk about the problems they have with the career system and getting people to ask for help. And the big surprise, I think, is that white women advocated for the things that I'll be talking about. There's no question about that. They advocated for most work-life policies because white women have more management jobs than women of color. But white women are not the main beneficiaries of these. So for each of the three things I'll talk about, people of color and men of color are also beneficiaries. So this is encourage flexible spending, scheduling. So what does that mean? This is just a policy where you have the right as an employee to ask your supervisor for every Wednesday afternoon off 2 hours early, and you'll make it up on Thursday. So you can pick your kid up from childcare on Wednesday because they have a shortened day. You have the right to ask, but they have the right to say, no, it won't work for me, sorry. Figure something else out. A lot of these requests are turned down, but just the fact that there's a formal way to ask and that the top brass says, you can ask, we want to try to help you, changes the climate in organizations. It's not a right to get a flexible schedule. This is, so since 1993, new parents have been able to ask for a leave of absence of up to 3 months unpaid. I've got to tell you, very few parents can afford this, especially parents of color, can afford to just take 3 months off with no pay. But some organizations have a mechanism for asking, and others don't. Others just say, it's the law, people will ask for the leave if they want it. If you create a process for asking for a leave, in principle, the employer has to say yes, but it has significant positive effects on the representation of white women, black women, but Hispanic men and Asian American men in management. And again, there are coefficients for the other groups that don't have bars. They just weren't statistically significant in these models. So I think this is very promising. That doesn't cost anything. And this represents what are called child care referral services, which is usually employers will get a contract from an outside agency that just provides them like with sometimes a map or some way to visualize where the child care centers are near the workplace, and often which ones have some openings. So this is showing very solid positive effects for everybody. And but this isn't paying for childcare. We have that in the model separately. This is just signaling that we want to help you find childcare, signaling that we want to allow you to ask for a parental leave, signaling that we want to allow you to ask for flexibility if you want flexibility, even though there's no requirement in the law. These are very big positive effects just for something that's quite symbolic. So I teach at Harvard. We're under attack by the federal government. Doesn't look like it's going to end soon. I've been on leave this year. Thank God I would have been chair of the department during this, because I was last year. It's a pretty depressing time in the US. All my friends who are chief diversity officers, if they still have their jobs, they're not able to do them. I think there's a little bit of good news in the story I've told today, which, as I said, there's a lot of stuff that employers could be doing that will not interfere with it, that do not transgress the anti-DEI dictates of the federal government. Mentoring programs for everybody. It's hard to oppose those. Recruit everywhere. Nothing DEI about that. And these work-life programs, so of course, when they pay for childcare, that has an even bigger effect. When they pay for a parental leave, that has an even bigger effect. But even these symbolic things seem quite helpful. And the one place where the left and the right come together are work-life programs. So the right isn't in favor of work-life programs for the right reasons, because they are pro-natalist, because they want the white population to expand in size. But they're still in favor of parental leaves and paid parental leaves. They're still in favor of flexibility and childcare options. So here's the book. I mean, the only reason you would need to get it, and I think at some points you can get it on Kindle for $10. I don't know if that's true right now, but the only reason you would need to get it is it surveys a lot of the research by other people that supports what we find. So this is, I've just been talking about our research. I mean, I could have cited, for each slide, I could have cited 50 other people who had done like one-by-one studies of mentoring or of childcare supports, but other studies tend to be one at a time. And I think the comparative advantage of ours is that we're looking at a lot of things at once. So it is, I'm going back to the US in July. I'm not looking forward to that, just because it's all, it's all people talk about. It's all my colleagues want to talk about all the time, the situation we're in. But I remain hopeful that we could make progress even with all that's going on. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Frank, for this very inspiring and thought-provocative presentation. I'm very sure you all have a lot of questions. But before we open the floor to the audience, we have three really great commentators. So please, everybody, come to the front and sit here while I introduce you, and I will tell you why we have these three brilliant commentators to Frank's presentation. Let me start with Gregory Jackson. He's professor at the Freie University on human resource management and labor. And he has a lot of shared research interests with Frank Dobbin on economic sociology, organizational theory. And while he does not do research on diversity, he surely knows what works and what doesn't when it comes to corporate governance and what makes companies change. So he has done vast research, international comparative research on corporate social responsibility, an agenda which is sometimes mixed with the diversity agenda, and why companies change. So welcome, Gregory, and thank you that you are here. my colleague, my dear colleague, Seyran Bostanci. She's a postdoctoral scholar here at DeZIM-Institut and works at the National Monitor on Racism and Discrimination here at the DeZIM-Institut. And her research interests are on diversity, institutional change, and anti-racism. But she also has years-long experience of consultations on diversity, and she really tries to bridge academic insights with real-life changes, trying to help institutions change structural discrimination. I'm very happy, looking forward to your impact also from the practical side. Thank you that you are here. And last but not least, Frank Kalter. He is professor of general sociology at the University of Mannheim, and as you might all know here in the room, co-founder and director of the DeZIM-Institut. He does not at all research on companies or diversity, but he's one of the leading researchers on integration, in particular social mobility on youth, migrant youth in Germany and Europe. So, and he's a total crack in statistics. So his rigorous empirical lenses really resonate very well with the methods applied in Frank's book. And here we have two Franks, also nice. So thank you that you are here, Frank. So we have short comments, including some questions. Then you have time to respond. You can relax for some time now, and then I open the floor to you until about 5:45. Then you can still stay here, have some food, some drinks, and also mingle and have additional questions if something is remaining unanswered. So Gregory, we start with you and do it in that order, maybe.
Stay sitting. Okay, yeah, thank you for the invitation. It's great to be here and great to discuss this really interesting book by Frank and Alexandra Kalev. Yeah, it's something I've used, actually not yet the book, but some related articles in my teaching. So I teach the basic kind of HRM class, I think the only one in Berlin. So what I really like about this book, I like the way it's presented together. I like its ambition, its scale, its rigor, putting together really a lot of research which has been published in like top journals, but like writing it in a really nice way that I think can really shift the audience. And after all, as social scientists, our articles don't have much audience, and I think it's important to go out there. It does another thing that good social science does. It brings fact-finding to bear on kind of commonly held assumptions or mythologies and so forth. So it kind of does a bit of myth-busting, fact-finding. I really think that's, we tend to focus a lot on theory and novelty and things, but good old-fashioned kind of myth-busting is really important. It also does what good sociology does, that it a little bit subtly shifts away from this kind of like individual psychology and cognition, which I think does get a lot of play in the kind of wider public discussion. We psychologize things, and this kind of emphasizes a bit, kind of meso-level social phenomenon, what people actually do in real-world organizations, which is nice that sociology can, say something. I'm a sociologist also by background. So yeah, shifting from kind of individual prejudice and bias to like organizational systems and the way career systems, internal labor markets, things that managers can do or not do, I really like. So I have two quick kind of nerdy questions, or a little bit more academic, and then I have a couple quick, more policy, practical related things. So, I study corporate governance and things like financialization, shareholder value, the changes in, how value is distributed in corporations. And a lot of the things, Frank, that do work, they seem to be things that really require some commitment by organizations. So not all of them are necessarily expensive, but they kind of like imply kind of sustained commitment and effort. And when I kind of look at corporate America over the last decades, we see, a lot of disruption of kind of stable career patterns, ILMs, the kind of the big kind of hierarchical corporations like dissolving, disappearing, work becomes more, contingent, project-based, and so forth. So kind of what does that mean? Like, if we read your book, we know what works, but can we do it? And like, what does it need from an organization to do it? A second nerdy point is maybe about theory or methods in theory. So I really like the structure of the book is a bit like the presentation. It goes through practices kind of one by one, and I kind of wanted to hear more. When I teach HRM, I always say, well, it's a system. It's like bundles, and your pay system has to match your skill system and your recruitment and so forth. And so, just kind of like to invite you to say a little bit maybe more about sort of bundles of things. I do a little bit of diversity research on German corporations, and we kind of found that commitment of organizations is like there's kind of multiple pathways to it, and it tends to be kind of like based on bundles of things, like having women in top management together with maybe the way those boards are connected to other boards, or like the way women and, say, male allies in the top management who are like, if they're diverse and they can kind of like get together with women and make kind of coalitions. So what about bundles? More practical points I have, being a comparative scholar and being an American in Germany, I kind of thought, well, how does this translate to Germany? And that's maybe an obvious context. In Germany, you said a lot of things are like mandatory by law. When we study CSR, this is called like implicit CSR, like we don't have health insurance at the discretion of our employer, but it's sort of built into the system. And so a lot of things are sort of more kind of institutionally anchored in different ways. So I was just kind of thinking about, how those kind of translate. And I think a lot of the German workplaces tend to be much more democratic, but I think also things like works councils can also work for diversity, but don't always work. So, I was just kind of bringing the question like, in what extent those can be kind of replicated here. And then I kind of thought, well, maybe like some of my team should like replicate Frank's research, and we should like get a big team and like do that. And I thought, well, can you actually do this kind of research in Germany? The empirical stuff relies on a lot of those quantitative data, which I think simply don't exist and maybe cannot exist in Germany because some of these, racial and ethnic categorizations, basically there's no data collected, and I think it may be, if I understand right, basically illegal to kind of collect that kind of data. So, we do have like organizational data in Germany, but it's not really probably of the nature that would allow us to kind of study those things. So I was just kind of maybe thinking to myself, well, what can we do to advance this kind of agenda and apply the kind of same rigor? You can do a little bit with CSR data at the kind of very aggregate level, but it's very haphazard, and I don't think the standard ESG metrics of corporations are really get into like enough fine-grained about the practices. And then I kind of thought about, well, how do I teach this issue in Germany? And I remember students grumbling about, especially male students, oh, diversity again. And I'm like, oh, did my colleagues teach this? Well, no, but right? So already this kind of like backlash. Yeah, yeah. And I had another kind of experience, particularly I think the German discussion, maybe because the data is available and for other historical reasons, the diversity discussion in Germany is very focused, of course, on gender, and in a way, in business studies, really only gender, right? And I had a kind of interesting experience teaching, and I kind of I thought, I'm not going to use the gender example, I'm going to do like racial discrimination. And then, when you put up a PowerPoint slide and you use the word race, right, in the slide, then immediately students are raise their hand and say, well, well, Professor, you know that race doesn't really exist, and you can't talk about race, delete the slide and so forth. And we had a really good discussion for about 10 minutes, and they said, well, but do you agree there's racism, right? Yes, of course, racism exists, but so what is that discriminating against, right? So it's just kind of interesting, maybe more comment than a question, but the kind of cultural references points, like in Germany, I think really has a very impoverished kind of vocabulary. Students don't know how to talk about these issues. We can't like verbalize a lot of them, and so forth. So yeah, what to do about this when we kind of don't have data, don't have names for the things that we're kind of talking about in diversity. And then maybe last point, but like 30 seconds. I thought, well, then how far does this research travel? It's a book about the United States, but I think the mechanisms you're talking about do travel, but then they maybe need like translation. And I was thinking about Egypt, and I received a delegation of HR, public service HR professionals, and they wanted to learn about German HR. And I made a menu of topics, and I put, I'm going to do DEI, right? And because maybe, in Egypt they don't, want to know about DEI. The delegation came in the room. It was 10 women, yeah? They were really interested about German works councils, trade unions, collective bargaining. They ate it up. They loved it. We had our break. I said, now I'll do DEI. No, thanks. We don't need it. In Egypt, men run business and women run the government. So we're fine. Next topic, please. So I thought about this, so the assumption of the book is something like integration, like all people should be managers. So we kind of like integrate. And I just kind of wondered. I mean, there's a lot of as we expand global reach, maybe other understandings of equality that are a little bit more. I'm like you, Frank, like civil rights movement. Separate is not equal, but then in a lot of places in the world, public spaces are very separate. And it maybe resonates with how other people think about equality. So I'll pass. Where am I passing to? Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. First of all, I want to express my appreciation for the tremendous contribution. Getting to Diversity offers, I would say, a rare combination of empirical depth, clarity, and long-term perspective. As you just outlined, in Germany, it would probably right now not be possible to do such a work. In a field often shaped by wishful thinking or vague commitments, this book provides orientation and guidance, and it encourages us to think beyond superficial fixes and to take structural redesign seriously. I think that this is a message that deeply resonates with me as an intersectional diversity and anti-bias trainer of about 15 years, and also a social scientist who studies institutional racism and transformation processes. The book convincingly debunks persistent myths, such as the belief that mandatory bias trainings or grievance procedures automatically lead to change. So I'm very happy that you mentioned this also in your talk, because this is what I prepared. It shifts the conversation towards institutional routines, leadership, responsibility, and measurable accountability. From my work in early childhood education in schools and also in community-based programs, I can confirm that this shift is urgently needed. At the same time, I would like to offer also some reflections from the perspective of educational practice. One of the interventions that you find to be particularly effective is the work-life balance policies. And I would say this may work well in corporate settings, but in the care-based, often also feminized fields I work in, such structural flexibility is still far from reality, even in Germany. In many daycare centers, in schools, fixed schedules, rigid staff ratios, and also under-resourced teams leave very little room for flexible arrangements. So while the intention behind these measures is important, their transfer into educational context requires a deeper look at the institutional and economic conditions under which care work is performed. This speaks to a broader need also, I would say, to contextualize diversity measures. What works in one institutional setting or in the US does not automatically translate to another. That is why I believe sector-specific expertise is so essential in diversity work. In education, the barriers to change are not just organizational, I would say, and this is also what we can observe right now politically. They are also emotional, ideological, relational, and of course political. In my practice, I work with educators who care deeply, I would say, about equity, but who often lack the time, the support, or confidence to engage in sustained reflection about power and privilege. This is where I see the 4 goals of anti-bias education, the concept that I work with. So I will just sum it up. The goals of anti-bias education is the strengthening identity, valuing diversity, critical thinking, and also taking action institutionally. I would say this is a useful compass in transformation. However, I also observe through my studies, but also through my teachings and the anti-bias teachings, that the last 2 goals, critical reflection and systemic change, are the hardest to realize in practice. And here I would say leadership culture becomes also very essential. Institutions that create, I would say in German, fehlerfreundlich or mistake-friendly culture, where discomfort, questions, and vulnerability are part of learning, are more likely to engage in meaningful change. And just to tell you from my experiences in the field is, one principal of an education center was saying to the colleagues, if there's something discriminatory in our practice, in my beliefs, in my sayings, in my actions, please come to me and tell it to me. And this, of course, created a mistake-friendly environment where nobody was scared to call out some situations where discrimination and anti-diversity is taking place. And this is something I would like to see more explicitly in diversity literature, the emotional and also relational dynamics of institutional transformation. Change is not only about procedures, it is about trust, about shared responsibility, and about the willingness to be accountable to one another. This brings me to another point that connects directly to my own research, complaint mechanism, as you also stressed out. You rightly point out that the grievance system without structural backing often fail or even backfire. In my own qualitative studies, I have seen how this plays out in education when, for instance, parents raise concern about racism, whether to protect their children or to request more inclusive learning materials. They are sometimes met with defensive reactions from institutions. In several documented cases, the act of filing a complaint was interrupted or interpreted as a loss of trust, leading to the termination of childcare relationship. This not only silenced families, but also reinforms the very discriminatory practice they were trying to challenge. What this shows is that institutions often protect their perceived neutrality more than they protect those affected by discrimination. Without clear principles, shared commitments, and procedural safeguards, complaint system can become tools of exclusion rather than empowerment. And this is why diversity work must be anchored in a broader transformation of organizational culture, not just in individual instruments. Lastly, I want to reflect on the way diversity categories are handled. You show that certain interventions benefit some groups while disadvantaging others. And I would say this aligns with what I often see in practice. The focus is placed on one category, for instance, gender, what you also just stressed out, or migration, while more complex intersections fall through cracks. Racialized women, queer Muslim educators, or working class parents of color often remain invisible in dominant inclusion frameworks. To prevent this, we need a diversity, I would say, a diversity practice that is not only measurable, but relational, intersectional, and also participatory. one that builds bridges rather than boundaries, one that centers those most affected, not as passive recipients, but as knowledge procedures in their own right. This is one of the core insights from my own work with community-based programs. Meaningful change happens when those who experience discrimination are not just consulted, but actively involved in shaping institutional norms and goals. But in practice, I always see that people who are affected by discrimination are always just not in the structures, but are asked as as critical friends from outside, who often are also not paid. Whether it's parents demanding inclusive learning materials or migrant educators bringing in multilingual expertise, this is not just feedback, it is epistemic contribution. And unless institutions, research and practice are willing to recognize this kind of knowledge, diversity efforts risk becoming technocratic and detached from lived realities. So I don't have so many questions, but my invitation would be, let's not only analyze system from above, but co-create them from within and below with the communities whose experiences carry both pain and possibility. To conclude, I see Getting to Diversity as a powerful resource for reflecting on structural change. Its contribution is invaluable, but it is up to us, especially in the education and social sectors, to carry it forward with care, to translate data into dialogue, procedures into principles, and institutional change into collective co-creation. Thank you.
Yeah, it's difficult, maybe a little bit redundant to some of the aspects before, but first, this redundancy has to be really, really happy to have learned about this book. Was very excited for several reasons, and as you already adumbrated a little bit, Sabrina, some of the reasons are more related even to my main job in Mannheim as a sociology professor rather than the director here, because I know you invited me for the statistical and method part, but I teach sociology, as you said, and I teach the introduction into sociology, and I teach lessons of what is sociology about. And I have to say this is sociology. I mean, we teach the students sociology is about the social and not so much about the individual. And there is no better, no more important question than the persistence of ethnic and social inequalities over time. So Durkheim, who emphasizes the social, also said, okay, sociology is about social institutions. And the key element of this book is social institutions in the sense of Durkheim, expectations about how to behave. You already touched a little. It's unten den Knopf. That's also an institution. This one? That's so easy. Okay. So missed Durkheim, but then we teach the students, okay, sociology, according to Pareto, is about the non-trivial, the irrational things, or following Merton is about the unanticipated consequences of purposive action. And the book is full of examples how things can backfire. You mentioned this already. So even beyond the highly interesting specific content, I think this is a very important book in more general respect. And if at some point in the future we ever need arguments why we still need a discipline like sociology, it will be good to have a book like this. I think we definitely need more research along exactly these lines in particular, and now I come to the methods aspects. I really see the book as a role model for more general, comprehensive research agenda on institutional discrimination and institutional racism. I think there are a series of interesting ideas and concepts available in race theory, in critical race theory, color blindness, fragility, defensiveness. and there are good reasons and some spread evidence that they really perpetuate long-term inequalities, but I think this still awaits stronger empirical, more strict empirical tests, and whether and how they really perpetuate inequality. And there's a tendency in racism research to think and state that institutional racism lies more in the realm of qualitative research, and I'm extremely thankful to Alexandra and Frank for demonstrating how all these things can, and I think also should be addressed more systematically and in more strict methodological ways, and that's exactly the way I think it should and has to be done. Using this rich longitudinal data from the EEO reports on workforce demographics and adding the retrospective survey-based information on structures and policies, really a great creative idea. I think it's an impressive amount of work included. I mean, we see all these bars here, which look like all the other bars we've seen in other, but these are real bars. I mean, these are really strong bars. There are many challenges, like the stability of classifications involved. All this is addressed in the book with high carefulness, with the highest reflection. Same holds for the preparation, implementation of the survey, the checking of the assumptions of the statistical models. This is really very, very solid. As I said, a role model for many, many related research on related questions, I think. Of course, research also in other countries. If you need a question at the end, I mean, this is a natural next step or consequent question. What about the differences, differential effects for the individuals? So it would be, of course, be nice to have this linked to individual data, not only to address things like intersectional questions, but also whether maybe the effects are stronger for people who are a little bit more privileged already within the group or not. I mean, that would be a natural subsequent research to do. Of course, the data situation might be problematic. In Germany, for example, we try to use, for example, the IAB employee linked data to address a kind of questions like this at the moment. But maybe you have some answers already from other research on the differential effects of these positive measures. But thank you very much again for contributing this book and for the presentation.
Yeah, that worked very well and resonated greatly. Now you have the choice what you can pick up and answer.
Well, let me just take maybe one. So this was super useful. You're very kind to have read the book for this. And it's clear that you did read the book, which is nice, even if you mostly had positive things to say. So just let me take one thing each of you mentioned, and then we'll have some time to open it up. So, Frank, your observations final observation that it would be nice to be able to look at what the effects of these programs are for particular individuals. So the good news is that although we don't have data in the corporate data set for individual effects, we do have, there's this amazing data set that the federal government has been collecting for decades, which is a 10% sample panel study of everyone with a PhD in the United States. So across our 640 universities, we have tens of thousands of faculty who are in this sample. Actually, my university has the biggest number of people who are in this sample. And we can look at the effects on individual careers of, say, women who have their second child before and after they get parental leaves, or black faculty members who come up for tenure before and after there's a tenure clock extension for faculty, for example. And we even know like when they had children, we know how much money they made, we know where they went to school. So I'm very excited to get further into those data. We're really just beginning to mine those data, in part because COVID slowed everybody on the research team down a bit. But I share your excitement for like trying to figure out whether individuals who are in a better position to begin with from a minoritized group are more likely to make it into the tenured faculty than those who aren't given a mentoring program, or whether the mentoring program mostly helps people who are not in a particularly advantaged position. Kayla, I really appreciated everything you had to say, and I have to agree with everything you said. So I want to talk just briefly about care work. Across the world, it's just one of the worst treated occupations. It's deprofessionalized, it's underpaid. In many places, it's transient work. In many places, the career trajectory is essentially you can either be a worker or you can be a manager of a small child care center or in a small care home, for example. I think it's one of the huge challenges for late capitalism, especially with growing elderly populations. So let me just say something about what you mentioned about parents who often experience backlash when they file complaints against child care centers. We've done research into alternative kinds of complaint processes that are less likely to produce backlash. And really, this is more like a literature review, but we had a paper in PNAS showing very adverse effects of typical sexual harassment complaint procedures. And then in Harvard Business Review, we published a paper showing the very promising effects of alternative mechanisms, such as using ombudspersons to process complaints so the complaint doesn't immediately get legalized and get kicked up to another level where you either win or lose, where there's some kind of effort to negotiate a settlement or try to find a solution that's appealing to the person who has the complaint. Also, dispute resolution processes that are designed, or mediation processes that are designed to make everybody happy or make everybody whole, seem to, often these can't deal with the worst kinds of abuse, but they're just less likely to backfire when the abuse is, when the abuse doesn't, or the mistreatment or the discrimination doesn't require the person who's misbehaved to be permanently removed from the situation or put in jail. Gregory, you've given me a lot to talk about. Let me just respond to what you said about works councils. Because in the US, as if you've studied American history, labor unions have been the group that's often most resisted diversity efforts, including after World War II, many labor unions refused to allow women to join, even though women had been in the machine shops, in the places where skilled labor unions dominated for the duration of the war, doing jobs that had been men's jobs, and men just got those jobs back after the war, and women lost them, and labor unions wouldn't have them. Labor unions in the U.S. have excluded black workers from joining for decades. I don't know, I know my friend Kathy Thielen studies works councils, so I know a fair amount about works councils here, but I would wonder if they are as inclusive as, for example, the unions in the United States for janitors, which tend to be very inclusive because most of their members are black and Hispanic. So anyway, thank you very much for being here, and I really appreciate all three of you for such thoughtful comments.
Thank you so much. And as much as I would love a closing statement from you too, as we are a little bit over time, I think we open up the floor for some drinks, foods, and general conversation. Thank you so much to every one of you.